The night the tower became real, the world came apart fast. Cities emptied. Emergency alerts arrived simultaneously on every device in every language, speaking to people who couldn't read them. Governments issued statements, contradicted them within an hour, and issued new ones. Cameras caught airport halls freezing mid-stride and then erupting into motion. One man in Seoul read the system message that had materialized on every illuminated surface on Earth, set his phone face down on the kitchen counter, and poured himself a glass of water. That was the detail that didn't add up. His name was Kang Jin-hyuk. The impossible ancient-looking structure now occupying the sky above every major city, the one humanity was calling a catastrophe, was something he recognized, something he had spent 11 years learning, floor by floor, until there was nothing left to learn. The rest of the world's panic made complete sense. Kang's calm was going to need an explanation. He had started playing Tower of Trials the way most people start things, picking it up casually, expecting to put it down. The tower didn't work that way. Each floor introduced something the previous one hadn't prepared you for, not just harder enemies. New rules, new physics, conditions where the only way forward required understanding something the game had never directly told you. Most players quit somewhere between floors 3 and 5. The ones who pushed further into the 10s and 20s were exceptional by any standard. Nobody cleared floor 50. Kang reached 50 on what he counted as his fourth serious attempt, not counting partial runs where he'd learned one thing and restarted immediately, and not counting the deleted character whose build he'd discovered had a structural flaw somewhere around floor 38. Identifying that flaw had taken 3 weeks. The restart had taken a year. He stood at the floor 50 completion screen at 3 in the morning, alone. A late meal, then sleep. He woke up to an updated world. The system message appeared on every surface that could carry light, in every language, at the same second. It wasn't long. Humanity had 90 days to clear the tower. Failure meant extinction. While news anchors lost composure mid-sentence, and governments scrambled for a posture that looked like control, Kang read the tower's real-world interface and found it exactly as he remembered. Same level structure, same skill and stat framework, same floor objectives, same coin economy, same hidden reward conditions that he had documented across 11 years of play, the ones the game never posted anywhere publicly, because finding them was meant to be part of the challenge. The tower had materialized in reality. It had not become unfamiliar. He ran a rough calculation on the 90-day timeline and started getting dressed. The noise outside his window was background. The first real-world system event appeared at a subway plaza in central Seoul, where players had begun gathering around a fountain the tower had marked as active. Kang arrived with a receipt from a convenience store in his jacket pocket. He'd stopped on the walk over and finished something to eat before he got there, and recognized the situation immediately. Mangrove of Greed. He had cleared this event 17 times before he stopped needing to think about it. He also recognized the man standing near the fountain's edge. Lee Jong-soo ran a content company. Kang had worked under him for years, tied to a contract designed for difficult exit, one where Jong-soo claimed a majority cut of earnings, where terms compounded unfavorably over time, and where clauses buried in the fine print extended his reach into content Kang produced on his own hours. Other people Kang had respected found ways out of that arrangement. He had watched them leave, one by one, while his own paperwork stayed locked. Jong-soo smiled now, with the expression of a man who had already decided this new world was simply a larger market. He proposed a partnership. Kang's knowledge of the tower, Jong-soo's network and resources, mutually beneficial. Kang stepped forward and headbutted him across the bridge of the nose. Jong-soo sat down hard on the plaza tile. Kang walked back to the fountain. The mangrove of greed erupted minutes later. It grew faster than trees were meant to grow, trunk thickening in seconds, branches spreading over the plaza, 4 golden fruits appearing on its highest limbs before the crowd had finished reacting. Players surged forward. Arguments became shoving. Shoving became something uglier. Kang stood still. He had watched another player bite into one of those fruits the first time he'd cleared this event in the virtual tower. The fruit was not a reward. It activated the mangrove's second phase, transforming it from a passive structure into a hunting one. The real prize was inside the tree's core, accessible only after the monster was defeated. It wasn't visible from outside. Nobody had told the players fighting over the branches that distinction. The first player bit into a fruit, Dark veins surfaced under pale skin within seconds. The tree shuddered. Branches that had seemed decorative demonstrated they were not. Jiangsu recovered enough to stand and found Kang again. He had a revised proposal. He had people, he said. He could coordinate. A new arrangement, better terms. He talked long enough for Kang to confirm the shape of what he was actually planning. Extract whatever Kang knew. Cut him out of anything that followed. Kang had already been watching the mangrove's vine sweep pattern, which rotated on a predictable axis. He positioned himself. He positioned Jiangsu. When the sweep came in, Kang moved left. Jiangsu was in the path. Kang moved toward the core. He knew where it was. He knew the pause between the monster's second and third attack phase. He hit the structural weakness at the correct moment, and the mangrove fell apart from inside. The system delivered 12 bonus stat points and the tree's essence. He stayed at level 1, but what level 1 meant, in his case, had started to diverge significantly from what the term implied. Someone filmed it. The anonymous video went up on whatever platform was still functioning and was watched by a significant portion of the people trying to understand what survival looked like in this changed world. The player in the footage was masked, impossible to identify. Kang wasn't interested in being recognized. He had a list. Days later, mana began leaking outward from the tower's lower structure. Certain objects, historically significant ones, old ones, things that had carried centuries of human attention, responded. Not full tower relics, but close enough to function. The National Museum of Korea was near the top of his list. He wasn't alone when he arrived. Players had gotten there ahead of him, and the situation inside was not orderly. A fire mage named Min Jong-woo had dealt with a creature that emerged when the mana surge activated something in the main exhibition hall. His control of flame was precise in a specific way. Contained, accurate. The kind of skill that hit exactly what it was aimed at without burning everything adjacent. Players circled him, trying to negotiate affiliation. He was declining, with declining patience. Kang made a mental note about Min's fire and kept moving. Park Yuri had activated 5 Anubis statues near the far wall. Each one moved with mass that left impressions in the exhibition flooring just by shifting position. She directed them through relics she'd already gathered, and she had reasonable grounds for her confidence. 5 stone constructs of an Egyptian war deity, each capable of destroying the building's interior if pointed that way. She pointed one at Kang. The spear arrived fast. He stepped into its path at the correct angle and redirected the shaft away from him, the way you'd guide a door swinging too hard rather than stop it directly. The stone hit the far wall. She sent all 5. Kang summoned the ruler of the mountains. The tiger emerged from the relic and moved through Yuri's constructs before any of them completed a step toward him. It wasn't strength against strength. The ruler moved as though the statue's mass was simply a fact about them and not a problem for it. Stone cracked. Constructs fell. 5 awakened representations of an ancient war deity collapsed into debris before Yuri finished watching the first one go down. She stood in the rubble without speaking. Kang was already past her, heading for the relic chamber. He found the mask of Tutankhamun in the correct display case without searching. 2 rooms over, the Sangpong Tongbo. Ancient coins that appeared to be ordinary historical currency to anyone who hadn't spent years learning which items carried hidden function, sat in an unlabeled case. He combined the mask, the coins, and 2 relics he'd collected in the hall. The result was the Eye of Trust. Its function was exact, directed at a person, and the system displayed their real information, their level, their abilities, the things they were hiding, and anything spoken within its range registered as true or false, with a precision that no amount of social skill could affect. 3 uses per day. 3 was enough. He turned toward Min Jong-woo. Min was still fielding the group that wanted him, absorbing the same request from different angles. He'd also been maintaining a containment barrier across the hall's south side since before Kang arrived. A barrier he'd positioned himself to keep others from noticing was effortful. Kang noticed, because Min's right wrist shifted position approximately every 40 seconds in the pattern of a hand working through fatigue. Kang walked over and mentioned, in passing, that the barrier had an opening on the east side. The expenditure wasn't necessary. Min checked. Min confirmed. The Great Map, the relic the room's dominant players had been competing over since the session began, was in a contested corner. Kang collected it, looked at it for a moment, and burned it. The players who had bled over that map made sounds. Min Jong-woo made a considerably louder one. His anger was genuine, complete, and met exactly the threshold required. The element of fire transferred into Kang's memory bank. He pocketed his hands and walked toward the exit. The tower's first floor contained considerably more than the goblin territories clustered near the starting zones. Deeper in, the system marked certain areas in red. Most players treated red as a warning. Kang had registered with the Association of the Awakened, the government body processing tower-active players, as a porter, the lowest available classification. His F-rank badge was freshly processed. The instructor who'd seen the real potential test result was still sitting with what she hadn't filed. He entered Labyrinthos with someone else's equipment bag on his shoulder. 6 players followed him in. He'd expected them. The one he was most interested in was Park Hana, who had appeared at his shoulder near the entry point with timing that wasn't coincidental. He'd used the Eye of Trust on her the moment she materialized. Commune, a proximity-based ability. It connected to a person's emotional state and subtly redirected their decisions without their awareness. She'd been running it on him since they met. He let her believe it was working. The labyrinth's geometry shifted as they moved deeper. Not dramatically, but in ways invisible, unless you had documentation of what the floor looked like before the adjustments. Exits became walls. The path back stopped matching the path they'd used. Several members of the group argued about direction. Hana structured the blame toward Kang. He said quietly that they had followed him involuntarily. One of them decided that was the wrong answer and attacked him. The Minotaur appeared at the junction ahead and resolved the argument with a single swing. The attacker died. The remaining players went very still. Kang turned to face the Minotaur. He didn't kill it. He watched it swing and moved just enough, the minimum to survive, letting the club's edge catch his side. The system registered the near contact. His gap stat moved upward by a fraction. He noted the number, pushed off the wall, and returned to position. Gap reduced the effective disadvantage between Kang and opponents who significantly outpowered him. It increased through close contact with such opponents, faster through intentional grazing impacts than through clean avoidance. He'd done the math during his virtual runs. He was doing it again now in a real labyrinth with real stone walls. Hannah pushed harder through commune, trying to generate some feeling that would redirect his behavior. He felt the edge of it and moved through it. He picked up a piece of broken stone from the labyrinth floor, an old habit from late sessions when his hands needed something to occupy them, and turned it over until his focus settled. Then he walked back toward the Minotaur. It took approximately a month. The creature had a berserk cycle with recovery windows between phases, moments of stillness when its aggression reset. Kang used those windows to sleep, eat what the tower's provisioning system supplied, and rest in the single section of the labyrinth the Minotaur treated as neutral ground. He had noted that location in his game records years before he imagined he'd need it as an actual bed. It was exactly where his notes said it would be. When Gap reached 100, his movement changed quality. The numerical distance between his registered level and the Minotaur's power still existed, but it stopped impeding him the way it had. He could use what he had completely. He killed it that evening. He exploited the stillness at the berserk cooldown's end, hit the structural weakness he'd cataloged during his first complete game run, and the creature went down. Hana was the only other survivor. She offered information, Bram's ring, a specific relic, a trade for her continued existence. He had now spent 240 hours near her, exactly the duration the copy condition required. He combined commune with the element of fire. The system produced Brand of Obedience, a control ability. Applied to a marked person, it compelled compliance. Violations triggered a system-administered consequence with no delay and no exceptions. He told Hana she was hired. She discovered, within the hour, that the brand was not a figure of speech. They became the first 2 players to clear Labyrinthos. Kang took her accumulated coins as advance payment for future services, gave her the location of Bram's ring, and watched her leave. She didn't have a meaningful alternative. Back in the outer areas, the Association of the Awakened had established mandatory processing for tower-active players. Kang joined a testing line with 2 people he recognized from years of playing the original game. Lee Tammin, who had the particular quality of remaining unbothered when unusual things happened, and not wasting words on it, and Yu Yanhua, who thought carefully before speaking, and was therefore usually worth hearing when she did. He used the eye of trust on both of them. The system showed him people telling the truth about who they were. He kept that information. He'd need them later. Park Hana appeared at the test center alongside her brother, Park Hajin. Hajin moved through the line with the ease of someone accustomed to his size mattering in any room. He displaced Kang from his position in a way designed to look incidental. Kang broke one of Hajin's fingers and put him on the floor. A man named Kim Gai arrived shortly after. The Eye of Trust couldn't fully read him. His level exceeded the eye's current range. Kang noted that ceiling with professional interest and negotiated with Kim Gai about a medicinal item called Goryo Ginseng and its documented side effects, which he knew precisely because he'd spent considerable time with that item during his virtual tower runs. The potential test produced an S-rank result. He leaned toward the instructor handling the results and explained that the result was not going to be filed today. She processed what he was implying and agreed. He walked out and told Taman and Yanhua he'd received F-rank. They believed him completely. The ruins were deeper in the first-floor complex, marked restricted, accessible to authorized raid teams and, technically, to any porter willing to sign a standard liability waiver. The waiver confirmed the porter understood they could be left behind if the situation required it. Kang signed without reading it twice, and fell in behind a large strike team whose guild leader believed this was a resource run with manageable risk. It was not a manageable resource run. He already knew what was inside. A guardian that slept until a specific chamber was opened. A strike team that would keep moving past every warning sign because no one in charge would admit uncertainty. And somewhere in the chaos that followed, a woman named Teresa Darenia, a holy warrior whose reputation preceded her into every room she entered, who was going to make a decision that cost her significantly. The Eye of Trust had already shown him her ability from a distance in the lineup outside. Blessing of Stars, a resurrection-adjacent holy skill, the kind that made otherwise final situations survivable. By Kang's assessment, it was the most useful ability held by any living player he'd observed. Copying it required him to save her life and create a real debt. He adjusted the bag on his shoulder and stepped through the ruins entrance. Deep inside, in the dark of the first excavated chamber, something that had been motionless for a very long time shifted its weight. The ruins' guardian was not a subtle thing. Its first movement sent cracks through the chamber ceiling, hairline fractures spreading outward from the point where its shoulder had brushed the stone. The guild leader, who'd ordered the advance into the restricted chamber, had stopped walking. The players around him had stopped breathing. Kang was already moving toward the side corridor he knew existed. The strike team's response was predictable, and exactly what he'd expected from people who hadn't studied this floor. The guild leader assessed the guardian's size, assessed his own team's position, and made the calculation that cutting losses was better than defending everyone. He ordered a withdrawal, not a strategic withdrawal, an immediate one, covering only the people who could keep pace. The weaker players, the ones who'd lagged behind, the porters who'd slowed carrying equipment, the newer fighters who'd joined the raid expecting guidance, were left where they stood. Teresa Darenia moved toward them. Kang had been watching her since they entered the ruins. She had the particular quality of someone who'd made a fundamental decision about what they would and wouldn't do a long time ago, and didn't revisit it under pressure. While other players calculated exits, she was already pulling people to their feet and directing them toward the outer corridors. She saved 6 of them before the Guardian's second sweep cleared the main chamber. Kang saved a porter. The man had tripped on equipment he'd been carrying for someone who'd already fled. He was approximately a second from being removed from the situation permanently. Kang pulled him clear, redirected him toward the side passage, and kept moving. The copy condition for Blessing of Stars registered in the system. He noted it. The Guardian pursued them into the outer corridor. It wasn't fast, but it didn't need to be. The ruins' layout funneled movement toward the center, and anything trying to exit had to pass through the Guardian's patrol zone. The strike team scattered across 3 different corridors in a way that was going to make reunification difficult. Teresa rounded a junction and found Kang there. She had apparently been told, by someone in the chaos, that the restricted chamber's breach was connected to the F-rank porter who'd been seen moving through areas a porter had no business entering. She drew her weapon. Kang let her explain what she was about to do. Then he caught the attack, held it long enough for her to understand that catching it had been effortless, and explained, in a few sentences, what had actually happened. Who had entered the restricted chamber? Who had ordered the advance? What the guild leader had decided to do with the people he couldn't carry. Teresa held very still for a moment. She apologized. He told her there was a secondary path through the ruins that ended somewhere more useful than the Guardian's patrol zone, and that he knew about her secondary quest because the ruins' hidden documentation was something he'd had access to for considerably longer than she had. She looked at him for a long moment, at the F-rank badge, at the porter equipment, at the person wearing both of those things who had just redirected a holy warrior's attack without effort, and made a decision. She nodded. They moved together toward the corridor of the corrupt. The corridor was not what its name implied aesthetically. It looked like any other Deep Ruins passage, which was probably intentional. The Guardian didn't follow them this far. It patrolled the outer sections and treated the corridor's threshold as a boundary. What waited inside was different. An elite lich occupied the central hall, with 2 additional Guardians flanking it. The barrier sealing the corridor's inner chamber was the kind that absorbed direct attacks and grew stronger from them. Standard tower anti-brute mechanic, designed to frustrate players who solved everything by hitting it harder. The Guardians were positioned to prevent anyone from getting close enough to study it. Kang didn't try to break the barrier directly. He spent several minutes watching the Guardians' attack patterns, calculating the angles, and then started redirecting their strikes into each other's flanks. The Guardians were not designed for friendly fire awareness. Their targeting prioritized the nearest enemy, and Kang moved through their threat range with enough precision to make their responses damage the barrier's anchor points rather than him. It wasn't elegant. A piece of rubble caught his shoulder on the 3rd redirect, and he felt the bruise forming immediately. He kept moving. The barrier cracked. A figure dropped from the upper corridor behind them. He was tall, composed, and had the particular posture of someone who had been waiting in a specific location for a calculated amount of time. He looked at Kang with an expression that contained several layers of feeling: recognition, frustration, something that had clearly been simmering for a long time. His name was Chaeyon. He said he had fought Kang 138 times across the virtual tower over the years. 138 challenges, not a single win. Kang told him he didn't remember him. Chaeyon's composure held, but only just. He challenged Kang to a sword fight. His skill was called Song of the Sword, a technique built around reading an opponent's rhythm and responding at precisely the moment their offense and defense were simultaneously committed. It was, by any objective assessment, excellent. Against most opponents, it would have been decisive. Kang used a fusion condition. The system recognized a specific combination of circumstances, the presence of a technique he needed to understand, an opponent whose commitment to the challenge was total and genuine, and allowed a copy under those parameters. He combined what he took from Chaeyon with a base he'd been building since the museum. The result was something the system labeled Grave of Swords. He used it. Chaeyon lost. Number 139. He stood there afterward, swords down, processing this in a way that was visibly effortful. Kang told him he was being recruited rather than killed. Chaeyon looked at the ruined ceiling for a moment, then back at Kang, and didn't argue. He had the expression of a man who had run out of logical grounds for objection. The inner chamber of the corridor opened after the barrier fell. The room beyond was larger than the corridor had suggested it would be, and the presence inside it was older than the ruins. Alice Fawn Ataraxia had been the corridor's master since before the tower's real-world appearance, and probably significantly before that. She was not large or loud. She had the quality of something that had been waiting long enough that urgency had become irrelevant. She looked at Kang and Chaeyon and Teresa the way someone looks at people who have entered a room they did not build and do not understand. She wanted Kang's blood. Not immediately. She had a more practical framing than that. His blood had a property she found valuable, and keeping him alive indefinitely as a source was more efficient than the alternative. She explained this without particular hostility. Kang listened to the full proposal. He had Bram's ring in his pocket, retrieved by Hana before he'd entered the ruins. He also had a specific understanding of what Alice's actual situation was, how long she'd been in the corridor, what she'd lost in the arrangements that had put her there, and what she wanted more than blood. He told her he could offer her freedom. He said he represented an organization with reach she couldn't access from inside this corridor. He described what they could provide in terms that were specific enough to be credible, and vague enough to be unverifiable. He claimed a connection to the demonic ones, the supernatural faction that operated adjacent to the tower's human player population, and implied that her situation was something they had interest in resolving. Alice's expression didn't shift dramatically, but her attention sharpened. She asked him to prove the claim wasn't convenient. Kang turned toward Teresa. What he did next registered in the room as a betrayal. He moved behind Teresa, and the action was fast enough that she didn't have time to process it as a threat before it had happened. He drove the blade into her from behind, in the precise location that the tower's anatomy system registered as critically serious. She collapsed. Alice watched this. Kang met her eyes and said nothing. The silence lasted a few seconds. Then Alice began to look at him differently. Kang waited for that shift to complete. He needed her belief to be genuine enough, not performed, but actual. The 7-star soul transfer was a skill that required consent from the subject, which meant he needed Alice to make a decision, not a coerced one, a real one, based on what she believed she was choosing. He told her he could give her freedom, but the mechanism required her cooperation in a specific way. He described the transfer process in terms that emphasized liberation, moving her existence out of the corridor and into a form that could travel, act, accumulate power again over time. Alice agreed. The moment her agreement registered as genuine, Kang activated 7-star soul transfer. The system required him to be level 1. He was level 1. The soul transfer moved Alice's existence out of the corridor and into the ring he held. Bram's ring, which he'd known for this exact purpose since Hana had mentioned it in the labyrinth. Alice discovered what had happened approximately 1 second after it was complete. The sound she made from inside the ring was not quiet. Behind Kang, the chamber floor lit up with a gold pattern that expanded outward from where Teresa had fallen. Blessing of Stars worked through the Holy Skills resurrection mechanic, and Teresa came back through it with the particular quality of someone who had experienced dying and was processing the experience while simultaneously having to deal with immediate circumstances. She looked at Kang. He told her he was sorry. He explained why he'd done it, including the parts that didn't make him look good. Teresa was quiet for a long time. Then she said that she understood, and her voice was careful in the way of someone deciding what they believed about a person while still in the same room with them. Bellis arrived before the conversation could develop further. Alice's primary vampire subordinate came through the corridor's secondary passage with a substantial number of others. They had felt the soul transfer and understood what had happened to their master. The response was not measured. The fight that followed was not brief, but it had a particular quality. Teresa, at full capacity, was a significant problem for anything on the opposing side of her, and Kang had a fire ability and a sword technique and a gap stat of 100, and the particular advantage of having studied how vampires behaved in the tower's original game. Bellis was formidable. The others were numerous. Neither of those things resolved the situation in their favor. When it ended, Teresa gave Kang her loyalty directly, not as a statement, as something demonstrated through the sequence of decisions she'd just made. The system registered the condition for copying Blessing of Stars. Kang took it. Alice, from inside the ring, was alternating between fury and what he suspected was the beginning of a more complicated calculation. She was intelligent, and intelligence eventually found the argument for patience. He told her that the ring was not permanent, and that what he'd promised, help recovering her position, access to the people who had taken something from her, was still available. He was still the person most likely to deliver it. She didn't respond immediately, but she stopped making noise. The Black Crow Guild had been involved in at least 3 attempts to eliminate Kang since he'd entered the tower. Not all of them were traceable directly to a name. By the time he had enough information to connect the order to Shinanu, the guild's master, the attempts had accumulated into a ledger that Kang found he had no interest in leaving open. He entered the Black Crow headquarters wearing a mask. He went through the outer guards with fire, which was efficient. The guards in the interior corridor received the same. Not every one of them survived the encounter, and Kang did not spend time on that fact. He'd come for the man at the end of the hall. Shinanu had built his reputation on a sword technique that operated at speeds that made normal defensive responses inadequate. He demonstrated this when Kang entered his office. The attack was fast, genuinely fast, by the standards of what Kang had encountered in the game's early floors. Kang broke the sword with the piece of stone he'd been carrying in his jacket pocket since Labyrinthos. He'd forgotten it was there until the hallway, at which point its continued presence had struck him as potentially useful. Shinanu looked at the broken blade. Kang told him several things. in order, what had been attempted, who had ordered it, what the results of those attempts had produced, and what the current situation implied about Shinanu's decision-making. He wasn't loud about any of it. He didn't need to be. Shinanu tried several approaches: justification, negotiation, the particular framing that people sometimes reach for when they've run out of other options. He talked about forgiveness as though it were a thing Kang was capable of being convinced about. Kang rejected it. He killed Shinanu. Park Ha-jin was in the building. Kang found him in a side room and looked at him for a moment. Ha-jin had enough capability to understand that the current situation was completely outside anything he could affect. He waited. Kang told him he was being left alive because his sister had been useful. He said it plainly, without emphasis, as though it were an administrative note. Ha-jin said nothing. Kang installed Kim Hoi as the new administrative head of Black Crow and walked out. The guild's remaining members were going to need someone to run the organization's logistical functions, and Kim Hoi had the specific combination of capability and practical self-interest that made him a reliable appointee. That was the extent of Kang's interest in the Black Crow Guild. What mattered now was what waited above. The third floor's boss had become the central problem for every major guild in the tower. The creature commanded a statue army on a scale that made the Anubis constructs in the museum look like early drafts. Wave after wave of raid teams had tried the floor and retreated with significant losses. The guild leaders were running out of approaches, and, consequently, running out of options they were comfortable with, which was why they were now considering a proposal from the demonic ones. The offer involved an undead army, a significant force, deployable against the third-floor boss, which would theoretically solve the problem. The guild leaders were desperate enough to take the meeting. The demonic faction brought an artifact as a demonstration of good faith, the Staff of Greed, supposedly rare, supposedly genuine. Kang examined it from across the room, through the eye of trust, and identified the problem within 30 seconds. The Staff of Greed required 3 specific components to function. The demonic faction's version was missing 2 of them. It was a replica detailed enough to pass casual inspection, but the eye didn't do casual inspection. He exposed this. The guild leaders absorbed the information with the particular energy of people who had come very close to a catastrophic mistake. The demonic faction's representative left the meeting with considerably less leverage than they'd arrived with. Kang filed the interaction as useful. He was building a reputation under the name Unknown, the masked player, and that reputation was becoming a tool of its own. Guilds that didn't know his real identity were beginning to factor Unknown's opinions into their decisions. That influence was worth more than any individual floor reward. He was still registered as F rank. He was still technically a porter on paper. The 4th floor was opening. The 4th floor's entry zone spread out as a vast open plain, fortified positions, abandoned keeps, and scattered outposts in various stages of ruin. The challenge was a 100-wave defense. That information didn't appear in the floor's briefing text. Players who entered without prior knowledge spent the first few waves establishing that something was coming, and the next several figuring out from which direction. Kang entered ahead of the main player population and walked to the stronghold he'd already chosen. It wasn't the most impressive structure on the floor. 3 other positions looked considerably stronger. Higher walls, better sight lines, more dramatic positioning. Those were the ones the major guilds were going to fight over. The position Kang chose had a less obvious advantage. Its foundation connected to a subsurface resource channel, the floor's hidden mechanics used to distribute defensive materials. Anyone holding that stronghold received steady resupply without ever identifying why their position felt easier than it should. He set up quietly and waited. Taman and Manhwa arrived by the second day, tracking his position through the light communication system the tower allowed between players who'd established basic trust indicators. Teresa arrived shortly after. Chaeyon came behind her, with the posture of someone who had stopped arguing about the arrangement. Teresa's regard for Kang had changed in quality since the ruins. She had watched him make a decision in the corridor that resisted simple categorization, and had apparently decided the category mattered less than the person making it. She checked on him with a regularity the others noticed. Kang noticed them noticing. He said nothing about it. The waves began. He knew the wave schedule in broad terms. The escalation points, the intervals, the specific moments where a floor mechanic introduced something capable of collapsing unprepared positions. He directed the stronghold's defense, with that knowledge running beneath every instruction. Tommen handled the left flank with the precision Kang had expected from him. Manhwa managed resource allocation without waste. Teresa fought with the settled quality of someone who'd made every relevant decision before the first wave reached them. By wave 40, the guilds holding the three impressive-looking positions had started losing them. By wave 60, some of their members had arrived at Kang's stronghold asking about temporary arrangement. He let the useful ones stay. The 100th wave's commander-class enemy appeared at its front, a creature whose presence altered the behavior of everything flanking it and required specific targeting priority. Kang moved for it before the wave fully reached the walls, exploiting the 5-second window between its emergence and its active command radius. The wave broke. The floor cleared. The 5th floor presented as a boss domain, a single governing creature at the center, substantial power, terrain that had been shaped around its presence over considerable time. The guild leaders who arrived expecting conventional engagement spent several failed raids before accepting that conventional engagement was not what the floor wanted. The true clearing condition was escape, not defeating the boss, finding the secondary route out of its domain and using it. The route was buried under several layers of apparent obstacle. Kang located it on his second day on the floor because he remembered where it was. The floor's second hidden mechanic was more important. The floor master position was inheritable. The divine urn the boss carried as part of its physical form could be transferred. Whoever held it after the boss's defeat, or after a specific transfer condition was satisfied, became the floor's governing authority. The guilds were focused on the escape route and ignoring the urn entirely. Kang had spent those 2 days watching Andera. She was the floor's secondary boss, subordinate to the central creature, powerful enough to hold her own territory within the domain. Her behavior toward the human players was reflexive and functional. Her behavior around the central boss was different. She deferred to it in ways that read less like loyalty and more like old obligation. Kang had watched that distinction for long enough to be confident about it. He approached her during a window when the central boss was occupied with a guild raid that wasn't going to succeed. He explained the urn. He explained the transfer condition. He explained what floor master authority actually meant, the autonomy, the territory, the release from the obligation she'd been operating under. Andera listened with the focus of someone who hadn't been offered a real choice in a very long time. Kang obtained the urn through a prepared sequence and transferred it to her at the moment the floor mechanic required. Her status shifted. The domain reconfigured. The floor's hostile designation toward human players dropped, and the central boss's influence on the terrain weakened visibly, a physical change in the air's quality. She looked at Kang. She understood what had happened and who had produced it. She swore loyalty to him. The 6th floor was opening. The Egyptian god domain existed in a transit space the tower had designated between certain floors. Different rules than the main progression. Different inhabitants. Different stakes. Players who passed through encountered figures whose civilization had understood something about the tower's nature long before the tower appeared above human cities. Kang dealt with Osiris first, which was a formality. The encounter was evaluative on Osiris's end, and honest on Kang's. He'd assessed the situation, and decided that transparency was better positioning than strategy, with an entity capable of detecting the difference. Osiris let him pass. Anubis was a different matter. He had a specific grievance. In the original Tower's game version, certain challenge mechanics had allowed players with deep system knowledge to invoke divine names under conditions those figures hadn't consented to. Kang had done this. It had been useful at the time. Anubis had been cataloging the offense since the real tower appeared, and the accumulated weight of that displeasure was not small. The tower's rules prevented Anubis from acting on it directly. Divine figures in this space operated under authority constraints that limited personal intervention against players, which was the most important structural fact in the room from Kang's perspective. Anubis sent a champion instead. The summoned warrior was large, armed at a level the system registered well above everything Kang had cleared to this point, and instructed to resolve the matter quickly. Kang won the challenge in a time frame that left Anubis visibly less satisfied than before. The direct confrontation followed. 3 questions, asked with the formal deliberateness of someone invoking a mechanism rather than conducting a conversation. The questions were structured to assess culpability, the weight of what Kang had done and hadn't accounted for. He answered honestly, because the eye of trust made strategic dishonesty toward an entity capable of detecting it a poor foundation for what came next. and because the honest answers were also the ones that created the best positioning. After the third question, Anubis activated Judgment. Kang's stats dropped by half, his active skills sealed. The Level 1 framework that had been supporting everything built on it became the only structure left standing. The domain's energy changed texture around him in a way that was immediate and complete. He was still on his feet. The floor introduced a giant mantis, the Judgment mechanic's physical enforcement. Its attack patterns were fast and apparently irregular, designed to overwhelm defensive responses through volume and unpredictability. Kang watched it for roughly 20 seconds. The irregularity was surface level. Underneath the apparent randomness, the attack sequence followed a time signature. Not simple, but consistent. He had spent 11 years in fights, where timing was the difference between clearing a floor and beginning again, and the rhythm tracking that process had built in him wasn't something he'd developed intentionally. It had accumulated. He stopped dodging reactively and started moving with the mantis's rhythm, not following it, occupying positions the creature's own momentum created, vacating spaces before the attacks arrived at them. The mantis adjusted. Kang adjusted to the adjustment. The creature accelerated. He matched the acceleration. The exchange reached a pace that should have been unmanageable for something operating at half its normal numbers, and became instead a very precise back and forth in which Kang was performing above what the modified stats suggested was possible. Gap operated from the base number, not the modified one. That distinction had just become the most important mechanical fact on the floor. The mantis began to falter after the exchange continued long enough for its own systems to register that the situation wasn't resolving correctly. It had no behavioral template for being countered by something that should have been below it. Kang helped it feel worse about this by switching from matching to something more deliberate, adjusting his position in ways that made the creature hesitate before committing its next strike. Hesitation from something that size looked specific. Anubis watched. He intervened directly, overriding the authority constraints that were supposed to prevent personal action against players. The tower's system pushed back against the override, with the resistance that comes from a rule being violated by the entity who helped establish it. That internal conflict couldn't be redirected cleanly away from Anubis's vessel. The vessel fractured from inside. Anubis hadn't been defeated by Kang. He had effectively defeated himself through the attempt. Kang copied Anubis' judgment before the energy finished dispersing. The copied version was reduced in scale and required asking the target 3 questions before activation, an awkward constraint in anything fast-moving. Used correctly, it halved a target's stats and sealed their skills temporarily. An ability drawn from a god's arsenal, sitting in the memory bank next to fire, sword work, a vampire's soul transfer mechanic, and holy resurrection. Anubis, reconstituting from the feedback, said they would meet again around the 42nd floor. Kang said he looked forward to it, and walked out without looking back. The 6th floor was classified in the tower's internal system as a leisure zone. This was technically accurate. The Elven Forest was designed for extended stays rather than rapid progression. Its clearing condition involved long coexistence with the elven population, and the environment's quality made players lower their vigilance. The elves were not welcoming toward outsiders, but their hostility was formal and territorial rather than immediately lethal, and players who understood the floor's social mechanics could navigate without major conflict. Foreign organizations, operating outside the tower's player population, had done their research on Kang's movement patterns and selected the 6th floor as the location to resolve him. Not for strategic reasons particular to the forest, because their analysis identified it as one of the few environments where his support network was limited and terrain would slow outside response. The Elven guards found the incursion before any human player did. The result for the first group of guards was fatal. The organization had brought enough force to clear the outer perimeter efficiently, and they'd used it. The Patriarch received the news, and the formal territorial hostility he'd been directing at the floor's human visitors became irrelevant compared to what replaced it. Kang became aware of the situation through a combination of the Eye of Trust's extended information range and a detail he noticed in the forest's ambient behavior. The way wildlife moved when something large and coordinated was pushing through undergrowth in a formation animals didn't produce on their own. He had seen that pattern in his game records. Sweep formation. Multiple groups converging simultaneously. The organization had established a communication blocking barrier to prevent Kang from calling for outside support. They believed that even at his level, simultaneous pressure from several S-rank fighters arriving from separate directions was an unsolvable problem. Kang walked toward them before the convergence completed. He reached the first group before the second group knew contact had been made. He hit the second group before the third had processed the news. The barrier that was supposed to keep information in kept information in. The operations coordinators received word of how the engagement was actually going considerably after the fact. The elves fought alongside him, not because they'd resolved what category he occupied, the patriarch was still working through that, but because the forest was burning in sections, and the cause of the burning was the foreign organization's fighters. Elves died. Kang couldn't prevent all of it. The force the organization had brought was substantial enough that the casualties were real and significant, and the patriarch registered each one in the manner of someone who had watched his people grow from childhood. Kang saw that understanding on the patriarch's face when the battle ended, and filed it as something that mattered, rather than something to move past. Among the organization's elite fighters were two ability carriers the Eye had flagged from the beginning. Thousand Poison, a layered toxin skill, each application adding to cumulative effect that reached lethal threshold at a point the target couldn't see approaching. Evil Eradication, a purification technique effective against supernatural constructs and controlled entities, the kind of ability that would matter in any environment where Alice was his primary asset. He copied both. The transfer conditions were satisfied through the combat itself, the duration and depth of the exchanges, the specific moments of full commitment that the copy mechanics required. When the last group of the organization's fighters had been dealt with, Kang built a barrier around the forest perimeter, a permanent one, anchored to the forest's own energy channels, constructed from the ability combinations he'd assembled up to this point. The organization would not be running a second operation in this location. Anyone who tried would find that the ground itself had been prepared for them. The patriarch stood at the clearing's edge, looked at the barrier, and then at Kang. Whatever revision he was making to his assessment, he made it without speaking it directly. The organization's planners began a different kind of meeting, the kind where the initial assumptions get reviewed. They had sent enough force to solve the problem they thought they were addressing, and the problem had responded in a way that required rebuilding the entire model. Kang noted that as a future concern, and kept moving upward. The seventh floor was cold, in a way that registered as a physical decision rather than a weather condition. The tundra occupied the entire floor from wall to wall, frozen ground that cracked under weight applied incorrectly, wind that moved horizontally and made vertical progress a negotiation rather than a given, and visibility that dropped to a few meters in the heavier storms and stayed there for days at a time. Players who arrived underprepared discovered this in the first hour. Players who arrived prepared discovered it was still hard. Kang arrived with equipment sourced through his network over the preceding weeks, gear that addressed the specific problems he remembered the tundra creating, purchased or acquired through channels that didn't ask too many questions about why an F-rank porter needed equipment at this specification level. He had also sent Hana ahead with a list of supply locations the original game had marked as non-obvious. She reported back through the tower's internal communication system with the particular tone of someone who had stopped being surprised by how specific his instructions were. The Phoenix Feathers were the seventh floor's primary objective, not the official one, which involved traversing the tundra and reaching the far exit, but the one that mattered to anyone with a longer view. Phoenix Feathers had restorative properties that scaled with the quality of the specimen and didn't degrade in the tower's storage system. They were rare, dispersed across the floor, in locations that required both knowledge and mobility to reach. Kang reached all 12 of his targeted locations. The traversal took time he didn't spend impatiently. Teresa moved through the frozen terrain with a steadiness that came from genuine physical capability rather than bravado, and the two of them fell into a traveling rhythm that felt like something older than the weeks they'd actually known each other. She asked him questions sometimes, not about his plans or his abilities, but about what he'd noticed, what the floor looked like from his perspective, how he read the terrain. He answered honestly, which surprised him slightly. Kaon maintained his position at the rear of their small group with the endurance of someone who had lost enough times to stop letting conditions become excuses. His relationship with Kang had settled into a functional arrangement, competitive respect traveling under the surface of practical cooperation, occasionally visible when Cheon won an exchange and Kang acknowledged it without ceremony. The 10th floor's central challenge was an immortal opponent. Not metaphorically, The creature's regeneration rate exceeded anything conventional damage could outpace, and the tower's floor mechanics had been constructed around this fact. Groups that attempted direct engagement arrived at the conclusion that something more specific was required, and then spent considerable time working out what. Kang and Cheon worked it out together. Cheon's combat analysis was useful in a way Kang hadn't fully anticipated. He read the Immortals' movement patterns from a different angle than Kang's system knowledge approach, identifying behavioral rhythms that the game data hadn't cataloged because they weren't mechanical but learned. The creature had developed preferences over its existence. Cheon spotted them in the third engagement attempt. They coordinated on the fourth. Kang used the judgment copy, 3 questions, cleanly delivered, the stat reduction activating in the window Cheon's positioning created. Cheon drove into the opening before the creature could establish compensating distance. The combination produced a gap in the Immortals' regeneration cycle that lasted approximately 8 seconds. 8 seconds was enough. The tower registered the floor clear. The system produced Immortal Stone Strength, a passive ability that increased physical resilience in a way that compounded over extended combat duration. Not immediately dramatic, but the kind of skill that changed the character of long fights. Cheon looked at the cleared floor notification, and then at Kang. He said he had lost count of how many times he'd watched Kang win from a position that should have been untenable. Kang said that was the wrong way to keep score. Cheon didn't respond to that, but something in his posture shifted fractionally. The higher floors compressed time in a way that was difficult to explain to anyone still in the tower's lower sections. Events accumulated faster, the intervals between significant developments shortened. Kang's network, Hana managing logistics, Alice providing supernatural intelligence from inside the ring, Andera administering the 5th floor's resources, Teresa functioning as both ally and anchor, ran increasingly smoothly as each member found the shape of their role. Alice had stopped making hostile sounds from inside the ring. This was not warmth. It was the practical recognition that her options were limited, and her best path toward the thing she actually wanted ran through the person she was currently furious at. She had begun providing information voluntarily, details about supernatural factions, vampire lineage politics, the kinds of knowledge that accumulated over centuries and couldn't be found in the tower's accessible documentation. Kang received this information without making a production of gratitude. She would have found gratitude irritating. He treated it as useful, which was the thing she'd decided she wanted to be. The tower's management structure was not widely known among players. Most people understood the tower had rules, floor objectives, system notifications, achievement mechanics. But the infrastructure behind those rules was invisible by design. Managers existed within the tower's population, positioned at levels no player had reached, and in forms that disguised their function. The tower's administrative layer worked best when it was undetected. Kang had detected it. A goblin tailor operating in a market space between floors 7 and 8. Unremarkable by appearance, the kind of NPC-seeming figure that players walked past without engaging. His work was genuinely good, which was the detail that had drawn Kang's attention the first time he visited the market in the virtual tower years before. Craftwork that good, at that price point, in that location, required an explanation that a standard tower NPC didn't provide. The Eye of Trust, used on the tailor, produced a status display that stopped Kang reading for 3 full seconds. Hasting. Tower Manager. High rank. Current assignment. Observation and evaluation of anomalous player behavior. Kang bought something from the shop and started a conversation. Hastings had known Kang was aware before Kang spoke. Tower managers at his rank monitored the Eye of Trust's activation signatures. The ability left a faint register in the tower's information layer when it read something above its designed range. Kang's eye had been hitting things above its range with unusual frequency. The conversation was careful from both sides. Hastings wasn't hostile, but he was assessing with a precision that Kang recognized as professional. Players who understood the tower's management architecture were anomalous in a way that created questions. Questions from a tower manager were not the kind to answer carelessly. Kang was honest about a narrow slice of what he knew and withheld the rest with the same care. The balance landed correctly. Enough transparency to demonstrate that hostility was unproductive, not enough disclosure to become a liability. Hastings, by the end of the conversation, provided a small number of things. Access to information Kang's network couldn't source. A channel that bypassed certain floor restrictions. the understanding that his progress was being observed by someone who found it professionally interesting rather than threatening. Kang noted the favor's size and nature and began calculating how it might be returned usefully in the future. Management relationships in the tower worked differently than player relationships. They required longer patience. He continued upward. The Black Wind Society occupied a section of the tower's cultural infrastructure, a Murim-derived organization with roots in a martial tradition that predated the tower's real-world appearance and had adapted to it faster than most groups without that background. Yang Helming led it with the particular quality of someone who had built genuine capability on top of a belief system that made his capability feel meaningful. Yang believed in the Dark Emperor. This was not an abstract conviction. The Dark Emperor was a specific historical figure in the Murim tradition, a martial practitioner whose techniques had reached a level that subsequent generations had spent centuries trying to reconstruct without success. Yang's organizational identity was built around that inheritance. He believed recovering or continuing the Dark Emperor's line was achievable, and that this goal gave the Black Wind Society's power a legitimate foundation. Kang understood this completely. He had spent time in the Murim-adjacent sections of the tower's original game, and recognized how belief of this kind functioned as both motivation and vulnerability. He approached Yang with a sword manual. The manual was physically appropriate. Old-feeling paper, dense notation in the correct style, a cover that suggested significant age. Yang received it with the controlled excitement of someone who had been looking for something like this for a long time. He opened it. He looked at the first page. The drawings were the kind a child produces: stick figures, misshapen animals, a sun with too many points. The notation was nonsense, arranged in the pattern of meaningful notation. He turned several pages. The content did not improve. Yang looked up. Kang told him the manual's value was not in its content. Its value was in what providing it demonstrated. He had access to materials from the Dark Emperor's actual lineage. This was one of the lesser pieces. The conditions under which he would provide access to genuine material required Yang to consider what useful cooperation looked like. Yang processed this. His desire to believe was strong enough to find a path through the deception, not because he was foolish, but because the alternative required abandoning something he'd built his organization around. He found the path. He chose it. The copy condition activated. Yang's conviction, genuine, complete, oriented towards something he wanted badly enough to override skepticism, met the transfer threshold. Dark Heaven art transferred. Kang combined it with Grave of Swords. The system produced Demon Emperor art, a technique that operated through the combination of Murim martial architecture and the sword rhythm intelligence he'd built from Cheon's ability, folded through the darken and accelerate principle of the Heaven art. The result was something the system registered as a higher tier than either component, which was the point of fusion. Yang submitted to Kang's authority with the sincerity of someone who believed he was submitting to the right person for reasons that would eventually become clear. Kang didn't correct his understanding. Yang's belief made him more useful, not less. The Black Wind Society's considerable floor presence became available to handle operational tasks that Kang found tedious and time-consuming. Supply acquisition, territorial management, monitoring developments in areas he wasn't physically occupying. A subordinate organization with genuine capability was more valuable than any single ability he could have copied from Yang directly. The 8th floor's entry point opened onto what appeared, initially, to be wilderness. It was wilderness. The floor's scale made this significant in a way that the word didn't fully capture. The tower's internal documentation, for players who could access it, described the 8th floor's primary maze structure as approximately 10,000 kilometers in linear traversal distance. The number was not approximate in the direction of exaggeration. The floor contained its own weather patterns, its own ecosystem, flora that had developed over the tower's internal history into forms specific to the floor's conditions, fauna that had done the same. Players who arrived expecting the format of the floors below found something that required recalibrating all of their assumptions about scale. Kang arrived knowing what the floor wanted: power crystals, hidden throughout the maze's structure, at locations that followed a distribution pattern the game documentation had indexed in detail. Finding them was not the challenge. His records covered the locations. Moving between them across the floor's actual geography was a different kind of problem. The maze's scale made physical traversal the primary constraint, and the floor's ecosystem introduced variables his game data didn't fully account for. The floor was alive in a way the lower ones hadn't been. Not hostile, the 8th floor's default state was closer to neutral than threatening, but it had internal logic that pushed back against people trying to move through it without understanding it. He had been on the floor for 3 days when he established contact with Melina. She had been on the floor considerably longer. Her presence was connected to the Demonic Human Association, an organizational body that operated in the tower's social infrastructure, the way shadow fills a room, present throughout, and identifiable only when you knew to look for it. Melina's role required intelligence gathering, at a depth that most players couldn't sustain, and most organizations couldn't justify sending someone capable enough to perform. She had been on the 8th floor mapping its power crystal distribution against the floor's ecosystem behavior, working through a theory about the relationship between the two that Kang found interesting when she described it. He found her useful. She found him unexpected. Their arrangement developed over the floor's first week into something functional. Her mapping intelligence combined with his location data produced a coverage rate neither could have achieved independently. She was careful and precise, in ways that suggested long experience with situations where imprecision had costs. She didn't ask questions about where his knowledge came from. He noticed she didn't ask, and filed that as a characteristic worth respecting. On the 9th day, she was working through a section of the maze the floor's ecosystem had designated as its own, a dense growth zone where the plant life had established something close to territory and reacted to intrusion with escalating resistance. Not aggressive in the way enemies were aggressive. More like pressure. She moved through it, with the focused attention of someone tracking multiple variables simultaneously. Something in the growth ahead went still. Stillness in that section meant something had chosen not to move, which was different from nothing being there. Melina stopped. She reached for the short blade she kept at her back. Not her primary weapon, but the one she'd developed the reflex to reach for, in moments that required assessment before commitment. She threw it into the darkness ahead. The sound of it stopping was wrong. Not the sound of a blade entering vegetation. The sound of something intercepting a thrown weapon cleanly and without the impact absorbing into what it hit. Something stepped forward. The darkness gave it up gradually, a shape that had been occupying the stillness with the ease of something that existed there by nature rather than concealment. It took a form as it moved into the perceptible space. Not the outline of an animal, not the shape of any creature the floor's ecosystem produced. A human form. It stood at the edge of the light the floor's bioluminescent growth cast from the canopy above. The dagger Melina had thrown was held loosely at its side, returned to her with a small gesture. She caught it without looking away from what was standing in front of her. The 8th floor's maze ran in every direction around them, 10,000 kilometers of interior distance, a floor vast enough to contain its own history, and something that was not a player, and not the floor's ecosystem, and not anything Melina's intelligence work had mapped as a known presence, had stepped out of the dark to stand in front of her. It didn't speak. It didn't move beyond the single step that had brought it forward. It waited,